the chess, ladies and gentlemen. All right, man, I appreciate everybody very much for stopping by. So as you guys know, we have the chess Olympiad going on right now in Chennai, southern India. So anybody who's coming from southern India, I will say Vanakkam to you. Nandri for coming by and taking a look at my video. If you're just a big enthusiast in that region. But of course, for all of my people that are coming from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay. Kamusta na aking mga kaibigan? Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Hello ulit. Magandang umaga, magandang hapon. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. And anybody who is coming from Greece, I will say yeah. And FIDE. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by and taking a look at my stuff. So I did take this game out of round 9. And this is somewhat of a difficult name to say, so you're going to have to bear with me. So I have Athanasios Mastrovasilis coming from Greece and Grandmaster out of Greece. And he also has, I believe, is a twin brother or he's just a brother, but they look super a lot alike. And so, yes. And then we have, of course, Wesley's son. So like I said, this one is taken out of round 9. So if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look, see what we have for this game. All right, so we got the move D4. Knight comes to F6. We got C4. And then we have E6. And as you guys know, you have so many different options in this position. But we do see Knight to C3. And this does invite the Nimzo Indian, which is what we see in the game. Bishop coming to B4. We see E3. You know, just making sure we're super solid on this D4 square. We got castles by black. Bishop comes to D3. We see D5. And as I always tell you guys, of course, you know, there are other options. I mean, D5 is what we actually saw in the game. And I mean, both of these pawns are available to play just to try to break down what white has. Because, I mean, you know, white has a really, really nice center. And, I mean, if you don't really do anything for a few moves as black, you know, white can set it up to where they can try to push this E-pawn. And then they just got pawns all in the center of the board. And you don't want to have that. And another idea as well is to push B6, which is actually something we see later in the game. But you can do it now and just fianchetto the bishop. Or maybe even, you know, push bishop to A6 with D5. It puts a lot of pressure on this point here. Just kind of how you want to play. But like I said, we do see D5. We see knight to E2. Pawn takes C4. Pawn takes C4. And it's important. I mean, it wasn't really another way. But sometimes some people have the satisfaction of knowing when the bishop has already developed to a square. You know, whether it's E2 or to D3. You know, it is then that you capture on C4 because, I mean, you kind of like make white waste the tempo a little bit. If white is not developed already and you go taking pawns immediately, then, you know, white has the ability just to take that pawn in one fell swoop. So you kind of want white to waste a little bit of time. So, like I said, knight to E2, pawn takes, bishop takes, and then now we do see the move C5, like I said before. We see castles by white. We have pawn taking D4, and then we have pawn taking D4. Some of you guys might be wondering, like, why did you just isolate a pawn? Like, you could have took with the queen, could have took with the knight. Well, the thing about it is, if black decides to trade on all of these different scenarios, you're going to end up with an isolated pawn anyway. So if we look at it, if the queen takes in this position, the queen can take, and then the pawn would take, and then, you know, you have an isolated pawn. And the other issue is, you know, capturing here, because if you were to take, let's say pawn takes, and then the knight takes here, you can take here with the bishop, and then as you see, you know, pretty much all the scenarios in it where you're going to have some type of an isolated pawn. So, you know, you might as well just go ahead and do it right here. So we do see knight to C6. We see A3. Bishop takes C3. Pawn takes C3. And then we do see the move H6. And this is just creating some lift for your king. But you are also, as black, you're sitting here looking at this and you're thinking, you know, black does want to develop its bishop somewhere. Of course, you're not going to put it here. But, you know, white is going to try to develop their bishop to a nice square, right? And a really, really nice square a majority of the time is on G5 because it can be a little annoying, you know, pinning this knight to the queen. So H6 is just saying, hey, man, you know, I'm going to go ahead and prevent that before it starts. So we do see queen coming up to D3. And then we do have the novelty of the game, which is a really nice find. Knight to a5. This bishop is really beautifully placed on this square. So black does kind of want to knock it down a little bit. So we do see the bishop coming back to a2. We see b6. Like I said before, we're going to see b6. The bishop has to come out. It doesn't usually, with this pawn on e6, as similar to French, it doesn't do the greatest on this diagonal. So fianchettoing it does do a good service. So we see rook to e1. We got bishop to b7. Knight comes up to f4. You know, white's just trying to get their pieces unraveled. We do see rook over to e8. We see bishop to d2. Queen comes down to d6. You know, super logical move. You know, queen takes, bishop takes. We're pretty much just trading there, so it's not so dangerous. We do see the move c4. And this does start to kind of push these pawns, but it also protects that pawn laterally. So we do see bishop to a5, like I said before. And for a lot of people that play against d4 as black, and they play like a Slav or any type of like, you know, French defense, you know, this is a very, or maybe even a Caro-Kann, this is a very common theme, you know, pretty much having this exact setup with the bishop and the knight. And then you do have a rook capable of swinging over. So things can get hot pretty quick. So the pawn does push to d5. We see pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, rook takes e1 with check, rook takes e1. We see queen takes d5, queen takes d5, knight takes d5, and we have actually reached the point in the game that if you do want to pause the video, I have two guess the move sections, and this is the first one. If you do want to pause the video and see what move Mastrovasilis plays in this position, it's a nice one. Go ahead and try to guess that. Okay, so it's not like something that's crazy explosive, but this is something I mention all the time. Always trying to look for like a Zwischenzug or what we know as in-between moves, right? And I mean, you know, you have the ability to definitely take here with the pawn. And it's not going to be as great of a thing as you might think. And I'll get into that in a second. But something that you can try to do in this position, which is what Mastrovasilis does, is plays bishop takes a5. And this is a really nice move because, of course, if black simply takes back, they're going to be having some really ugly double pawns on the rim. And that is not quite going to be where you want to be as black. But, of course, it's Wesley, so he's playing something different. So after we saw the bishop taking a5, we did see the knight escaping itself. But going back, like I said before, after knight takes d5, you do have the ability to take with the pawn. And you might be thinking, man, okay, good. Like, I got a pass pawn and everything. Like, everything is gravy, right? Well, the problem is this bishop is undefended here on a2. So you are going to be looking at the only move, which is bishop to c4. And you are attacking both of these pieces. And, you know, of course, you can't just push the pawn because you're going to be losing your bishop. And that's going to be you know, all the way to the crib. We do see, like I said, knight coming to f4. We do see bishop back to b4. Of course, you're going to save the bishop. You're not just going to leave it there so it can get taken for free. But we do see rook over to c8. And we have a slight problem trying to move the rook over here because this knight is plopping into d3, which is what we do end up seeing. But we do see g3. We see knight down to d3. Rook comes up to e7. This is by far the most active move to play in the position. Simply because, I mean, you know, there's a lot of nice juicy pawns on the 7th rank. And that is, you know, of course, why we always try to put the knight on the 7th rank. So we do see bishop taking c4, bishop taking c4, rook taking c4, rook taking a7. So, I mean, everything's pretty, you know, pretty equal. But we do have this knight capturing on b4. After the pawn captures, you know, black is just in not a completely winning position, but they are in a superior position at the moment. So we do see g5. It was also possible to just capture the pawn directly. So, I mean, either one would be legitimate, but, you know, you're just trying to get your pawns rolling a little bit, and you do have some ideas going on. So we do see b5. We see rook over to b4. We see a rook over to b7. Rook takes b5, and then as you can see, you know, black is up an entire pawn, but it still takes some technique to win this because it's not just automatically won. So we do see king up to g2, king goes down to g7, king goes up to f3. We see rook to b3 with check. The king comes down to e2. And then we do have another guess the move section in this position. If you've watched my in-game videos at all, or you are familiar with in-games at all, I feel like you should be able to guess this move. But if you want to go ahead and take a second and try to guess what move Wesley So plays here, it is hyper accurate. Go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So, like I said, for anybody who is familiar with endgames and kind of how pawns, work against each other in the endgame, the juiciest move that should step out to you, or that should stand out to you, is the move G4, and that is exactly what we saw in the game. So, if you guess G4, congratulations, you are an in-game gangster. You guys hear me talk all the time about pawns freezing other pawns, and usually it is something like this, where there's just two. Or like something like that where there's just two of them. But it works just as well with three as well. So after we see the move G4, white really can't push these pawns very effectively. So it really freezes white in their position. And black is in a very solid position. Not completely won, like I said. I mean, you still need some finesse with it. But, the position is a nice one for black. So we do see rook up to B8. We see H5, we see rook down to B7. And I mean, something that you just got done probably noticing is that white is really just kind of shifting back and forth. After this G4 move, like I said, these pawns are pretty frozen. So you don't really have a whole lot that you can actually do. And this rook is in the perfect spot to cut this king off. So the king can't really make any progress. So this is a very passive position for white to be in. So we do see rook up to B5. We see king down to F1. King goes to F6. We see rook over to C7. We are dreaming. You know what I'm saying? We're like, hey, man, let's like try to get something rolling somewhere. But Wesley So says, nah, man, we can trade if you want to. And Mastrovasilis says, nah, we can't trade, man. Of course not. Because since black is up material, and of course, you do not want to trade off, because then you are going to have this king against an outside pass pawn, and that is going to deflect this king this way, and then this king is going to be able to start, hitting some nom-noms over here. So we don't want that. So the rook goes back to B7, like I said. We do see B5. The king goes up to E2. We see rook over to F5. We see rook down to B6. And this is kind of like a spite check because this check doesn't really serve a purpose. It's just kind of like it gives me the ability to like attack your king. So we do see king up to E7. We got F4. And I mean, white has hopes and dreams, man. If black lets this stand, then they literally just got a much better position. So you are, of course, not going to do anything other than pawn takes F3 en passant. And not only does this just give your pawn away, it gives the opponent another pass pawn. And that is the absolute opposite of what you want to do. But there really isn't much better to do. So the king goes over to F2. And you have king over to D7. You got H3. I mean, you're dreaming of maybe doing this here, and then you have some type of something. Maybe you can deflect the rook and just, snap that pawn off, but that's not happening. We see king over to C7. A rook goes over to A6. We see B4. Pawn's getting kind of dangerously rolling. We got rook down to A4. A rook goes to B5. Now we have to go further down. King takes F3, but we're not worried about that pawn over there because we do have this nice pawn on B4. And there isn't a whole lot stopping it from hitting B1. So we see B3. We got rook down to A1. It's the only option that you have. The king goes down to B6. We got G4. We see B2. The rook goes over to B1. Now you are in a 100% passive position as white. You cannot move your rook whatsoever. So we do see pawn taking G4. And then even though you're completely lost anyway, you do want to take with the king in this position because you give yourself a pass pawn with some type of possible maybe hope. We got king over to A5. We see H4. King to A4. We got H5. The king comes down to B3. We see H6. And then the king comes down to A2. We see H7, which, I mean, if we just leave the rook here and the king captures and we clean, I mean, you're actually in a completely winning position. But that is not what we saw. We saw rook coming back to B8. It is in this position that Mastrovasilis resigns the game. And some of you guys might be wondering, like, why he completely resigned. I mean, this position is, like, completely lost. But it might not be 100% clear as to like why it's lost. Well, the problem is you have two options. You can either go like full steam ahead and try to promote this pawn, and force black to kind of give up their rook for your queen. Or you can try to defend this queening square. Either one of them is completely lost. It doesn't matter which one you choose. But if you're going to go the route of the rook trying to defend, kind of do both duty, you're going to pretty much have to move it to one of these squares. And it seems like maybe h1 would be the best square to go to, because simultaneously you're kind of defending, but then you're kind of pushing the pawn too. So if you move rook to h1, the queen is going to appear on the board on b1. And then, of course, you have two options. You can either take with the rook here, which would result in this king taking, and then you literally have like zero dreams of, you know, promoting this pawn ever. Or you can just simply just push the pawn immediately. The problem with this particular position, even though it looks fairly equal, is that black actually has like a couple different ways to mate you. You would see queen coming to e4 with check. The king would go up to g5. Rook coming down to b5 with check, and you have two options in this position. You can either just move the queen in the way, which is actually suggested, or do the move that seems like it makes a little bit more sense and go king up to f6. But then after queen to e6 with check, king goes up to g7. Queen to g6 with check, king to f8. Rook to b8 with check. The king comes down to e7, and then queen goes to e6. This is checkmate. And like I said, throwing the queen in the way was like, you know, it actually held checkmate off for another move, but it's all losing anyway. Other than that, like I said, going back, you know, if you just move to any of these squares, rook h1, for example, and then you queen, I mean, you do have the ability to try to go here. But like I said, this king is going to take. And I mean, you're just not close enough. So the major issues that white had is that black's position, especially black's king, had come into like the most dominant position on the board. And so, like I say before, for those of you that, you know, like you get into end games and you think, or just at any point in the game, the king really doesn't matter. The king is a very, very effective fighting piece when you do get to the end game. Basically, once the queens come off the board, it is much safer for the king to move around. So you do want to use your king as much as possible. And this was a perfect example of using the king to get into a very, very nice end game. And that is what Wesley showed here. So Malaka see Wesley. So I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. And I will see you guys next time.